talking, too, about the relationship between language and place, language and individual identity and place. All these things, for him, kind of make a singular map for us when we look at this novel. So on the one hand, it's a kind of clear statement of an artistic view, in which geography, language, psychology, and lived experiences are all kind of commingling in this instance. He also said in the memoir as well that I have sometimes thought that the novel form does not fit an American writing, that it is a form which has been brought in. And I think this is a response to that too, this sense that somehow the novel doesn't work to get at what he wants to say about what it means to be not just American, but in small town. How do you kind of convey that experience? The novel doesn't for him quite do it. So he turns to this text that people still kind of argue about, well, what is it? Is it a novel? Is it a short story? How do we kind of interpret this thing? So I think this is a gesture towards that feeling too, that there's something about the pure novel form that does not, in his mind, work. So in both of these comments, I think, and in this opening to Weinsberg, we see that he's kind of expressing that there's an appropriate and effective form of American art, the traditional forms are not it, which makes sense for what he's writing. It's 1919, it's modernism, it's experimental. But even more than this, I think what's important to take away from this as we think too then about how the Triumph of the Egg opens, which we'll see in a second, is that to sort of get to the lives of these ordinary people, these common people that he believes are nevertheless very important, we can no longer sort of use these traditional forms. We have to do something different to convey that experience. So the visual map is sort of a way to convey that experience. The geographic representation of the town, that also serves as a map for the characters themselves going through this sort of progression. So, the Triumph of the Egg opens with two sort of separate sections that precede the text. The first is this sort of poem, this long sort of poem that he actually puts before the title page. It's the very first thing we encounter. So he's talking here, he's kind of doing something similar, I think, to the map. He's setting up this sort of domestic image, right? He's talking about a house, this person being in the house and looking out on the streets, looking out at the townspeople moving around, and being able to see them, but not being able to touch them, right? He's talking about sort of this distance that he's experiencing. So this is sort of a verbal map, right? In sort of the epigraph fashion. It's giving us another way to think about what's going to come up next. It lets us know about a number of the important aspects of the work. There's the thematic concerns with loneliness and isolation, this inability to kind of commune with one another, to understand one another. The desire of each person in this poem to tell a story, but their inability to tell that story. Both the speaker of the poem but also the subjects, they all have this sort of burning desire to tell something about themselves, but they can't speak it, which if you've read Weinsberg is a very familiar sort of theme from that book. Have this story heard. There's also this theme of violence and despair that results from these failures, whether it's sort of psychological violence or in some cases physical violence, right? They're described as dying of cold and hunger. There's this very sort of disempowering, dispiriting sense throughout this opening piece. And there's also a sense of individual death, and I don't necessarily mean physical, but sort of spiritual, emotional, intellectual, that seems to result from this. That their tale is left to die in the street. Right? That no one cares about these lives that these people are living. And Anderson is saying, I think, in this moment, right, that we need to think about what this text is doing in relation to that question. What is he trying to get at about these people's lives? The speaker tries to offer them some comfort, right? He's struggling to do that, he or she. It's not necessarily clear. But they're trapped in this house. They can see, but they can't do anything. At one point he says, quote, I should be weaving warm cloth out of the threads of thought to clothe the tales freezing on the doorstep. So there's even this sort of very Christian sort of message here too, right? The idea that I should be doing something to sort of help them, to clothe the needy, but of course in a more artistry sense. But he can't do it. He can't get to that point. So the poem is on one hand, right, a commentary on artistry itself. Its importance, but also its limitations, the role of the American artist, and most specifically of all, perhaps Anderson's own view of the work that's going to follow. Right? I think there's a sense that he's aware that maybe he hasn't done everything he set out to do. And I think that speaks to the sort of the connection between this book and Weinsberg. They're both, in a way, kind of working through similar questions. So this poem prepares the reader for what's going to come next. And then, of course, we have the busts. There's 3 of them over there, which I was surprised to see how small they were. I was expecting something larger. But they're these small busts that were created by Tennessee Mitchell, his second wife, which, depending on sort of your perspective, he's either famous or infamous for having 4 wives. So she made these renderings of different sort of figures from the stories. Some have captions that are more descriptive than others. Like some are linked with specific stories, others are just, labor, well-to-do. So there's these sort of archetypes that are being constructed here for us. So these photographs are like the poem. They seem to be conveying something similar, and there's also like the map, right? They're giving us a way to think about the text that's going to follow. So there's 15 stories come out. We only have 7 images here, but they do suggest what Anderson's going to be doing in terms of his use of concepts of gender, sex, regionalism, race, isolation. All of these things are kind of hinted at in these bust images that we have here. But they're also not traditional, right? It's not something we expect in a novel. The map maybe, but not sort of these images that we're getting here. There's also a sense, I think, with these that Anderson is trying, by really any aesthetic means available to him, to convey the intimacy of these individual portraits that are being followed. That these stories are as intimate as these images, right? I mean, it's hard to get more intimate than a person's face. This is recognizing what it should be. But on the other hand, too, he's monumentalizing these people, right? These are ordinary people that he's commemorating. I mean, who normally gets busts made of them? Roman emperors, presidents, Shakespeare, right? Philosophers, but then of course we have sort of the small town banker, we have the domestic worker, so he's putting them on a level playing field. He's saying these people are just as important or just as worth memorializing or remembering as others. So even while his kind of speaker of the poem is trying to break through the walls of decorum or manners or politeness to sort of commune with these people on the streets, the busts are another effort to do that, to kind of break down the barrier we have between ourselves and other people, which seems to be central to what he's doing here. So he's saying right at the beginning that these people have important stories to tell, and they've made important, if kind of unseen or unacknowledged, commitments or contributions to sort of the human condition. Which is very similar to what he's doing in Weinsberg, right? Kristin, I think you're next to talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so as Aaron said, it's a book of short stories, really similar to Weinsberg, but what's a little bit different in Triumph compared to Weinsberg is that the stories aren't quite as interconnected in terms of plot, they're more connected in terms of theme. So you don't see as many recurring characters, things like that. So what I'd like to talk about, since we have kind of an overview of the book at this point, is the reception history. So what were people saying about the book when it first was published and in the decades after that? And I think probably in Clyde, people know more about how Anderson has been received over the years than maybe anyone else. But I'll talk to you a little bit about kind of how opinions about Anderson have changed since the book was published in 1921. All right, so a review in The Nation in 1921 said, "It is a book full of weariness, full of contempt and self-contempt, of a bitterness that has frothed its last and is now icy and stagnant. What will people do with this book? For it is a book full of terrible accusation." And I'm sure you all are now excited to read and purchase the book. But I think that's the theme that critics and readers kept coming back to, is that they felt accused in some way by the book, and they couldn't quite put their finger on how. Like, what is this book doing that's making me feel challenged or accused in some way, right? And the question that authors and critics and readers kept asking is, what do we do with this book? What do we do with it? So we'll kind of keep coming back to that question throughout the presentation tonight. But the idea of accusation, I think, is really significant because it's people felt that Anderson was accusing them of being secretly unhappy, right? Of kind of always being on the verge of some sort of outburst. And how many of you, I'm just curious, how many of you have read Weinsberg? Okay, yay, this is good. And there are a lot of outbursts in that book, right? It kind of goes from outburst to outburst, right? And people who don't have those kinds of personal just explosions or those frantic moments, they're about to. Right? They're kind of always on the verge of doing that, right? Of running down Cherry Street in the middle of the night. And I think that's kind of what's carrying over to Triumph of the Egg, is the idea that people are always on the verge of something, right? They're kind of always on the precipice of having this this moment where they're it's kind of a breaking point for them, and that's what's carrying through to Triumph as well. And that doesn't sit well with everyone. Not everyone was comforted by reading that, but that's kind of the overarching theme of a lot of the critics' responses. We felt accused. What do we do now? But they had different interpretations as well. This is part of the accusation that I wanted to get to. In a review from The Nation, again, an author wrote, "One way of dealing with Mr. Anderson's book is the way of blank denial. So just everything's wrong in this book. It's complete denial. You can say, the chap who sells me cigarettes at the United Cigar Store, or the plumber who comes to repair my train is no Melville Stoner," an important character in the book, "who comes to repair my train. He's no Melville Stoner who feels that he has always missed out on life." Or you could say that Paul Westside, another important character in the book, who was without regret that life was becoming an old, worn thing for him. He was a good husband. He was a good father. These people are so complicated. And you could also say that Rosalind Westside, Walter Sanders, and Hugh Walker, all of these characters from Triumph, and the foreman who who stared at the girl in the office and murdered his wife, are freakish and exceptional, and don't represent the great body of decent, satisfied, clean living Americans who have a little money in the bank and vote for Republican ticket. It's not a subtle here. So the author is saying, you can read Triumph of the Egg and say, this doesn't resemble anybody I know, but you might be in denial about that. But I think that's what makes people really uncomfortable about the book, is that it feels a little bit familiar. Another review, also in The Nation, commented, "In these episodes and stories, there are pages as memorable as have been written by any contemporary American." So again, we come back to that idea of people being made really deeply uncomfortable by Anderson in some significant way, but they know that what he's doing is memorable. They know that what he's writing is important, that it's significant and resonant in some way. Because as Aaron mentioned, he's really memorializing Midwestern America. Right, people who live in what's often called erroneously flyover country. Yeah. Sorry, I'll switch this word just a little. All right, so in the Current Opinion book review of 1922, a reviewer called the book a veritable chamber of horrors. Again, you really want to buy this term. But even though it's shocking and disturbing, it's really beautiful. It's beautiful in a way that you can't stop staring at it. It's disturbing in that way. So The Triumph of the Egg is an artistic whole, again from The Nation. So it's disturbing, it's problematic, but it's gorgeous at the same time. William Fagan in the English Journal in 1927, again the book came out in 1921, said, "Sherwood Anderson is a personification of evil, but The Triumph of the Egg is written with passion, with a fire that almost scorches. There are stories that reach out, searching, corroding into the tissues of our life." So many contradictory responses to this book. It's problematic, it's evil, it's disturbing, it's beautiful. What do people do with this book? So a lot was said about Sherwood and Anderson, the Triumph of the Egg, Weinsberg, in the early to late 1920s. But between the 1930s and the 1950s, scholarship and interest in Anderson really dropped off at that point. I mean, there are some comments and some articles written about Anderson during that time, but really not many. However, in the 1960s, scholars and readers became really interested in how Anderson was influencing other writers and which writers had influenced him. So particularly William Faulkner. William Faulkner actually said that he wouldn't have written hadn't been for Sherwood Anderson. Yeah, so there's a really significant and important connection. F. Scott Fitzgerald, they're definitely the author of The Great Gatsby, of course. Some really important connections between their writing. And a lot of people argue that Anderson was influenced by Mark Twain, and I think you can make a pretty good case for that. But in terms of influence studies, people became really concerned with the idea that Anderson was relying too heavily on other people, too heavily on other writers. And Erin mentioned that the poem that starts The Triumph of the Egg suggests that maybe the book was unfinished in some way, that it wasn't quite done. A reviewer from the Dial said the same thing in the funniest possible way. Whether he will achieve a greater perfection in a short story depends largely on his ability to extricate himself from the debilitating influences of other writers, so Faulkner, Fitzgerald, Stein, and to think out his problems alone. At present, we feel Anderson somewhat resembles a man who, having planted a fine bed of radishes, tends them rather carelessly and sells them before their time, so that when one comes at least to buy them in the market, they turn out, unfortunately, rather softer than any good radish has a right to be. It wasn't done, it wasn't right. It's probably in the early 1920s, nothing felt quite done. That was such an enormous thing about people. It just felt raw, unfinished in some significant way. Current scholarship on The Triumph of the Egg really focuses especially on individual stories, specifically the title story, The Egg, and I want to know why. And we'll talk more in just a minute about why it might not be a great idea to focus only on individual stories, because the book is important as a whole. We'll talk about that. But currently, when scholars write about The Triumph of the Egg, they specifically focus on the themes of regionalism, the American Midwest, race, gender and sexuality, and of course the American dream.
So yeah, I think Kristin nicely led into this, thinking about the similarities between the two, and perhaps also why Weinsberg is the more beloved of the books. For a couple of reasons. One, The Triumph of the Egg, for most people who've encountered, portions of it have been encountered in sort of a carved-out fashion. Maybe they've encountered the egg, maybe I Want Some Wine, in an anthology. I mean, they've done this with Weinsberg too, but I think it's more often that you see The Triumph of the Egg kind of singled out with specific stories. And I think that does a real disservice. In terms of the similarities, form, obviously, they share a lot in common. They're both short stories cycles. The Triumph of the Egg is a little bit less overt in sort of its recurrent characters. We don't have a George Willard in The Triumph of the Egg, for example. We don't have sort of that almost confessor figure that George becomes at odd moments. But we do have a recurrent speaker in the poem that opens the book. And then there's another poem, The Man with the Trumpet, that closes it. And it's not exactly clear if they're the same speaker, but I think they are. They're unnamed, they're both unnamed, they're both really ungendered, but they're both artists. They're both talking about artistry in different ways, and the failures of artistry in different ways, and voicelessness in different ways. And we'll talk more about that specific story, or that specific passage in a bit. In terms of thematic concerns, they're very similar. They're both focused on region. The Triumph of the Egg is a little more wandering. He goes to the border states, which is stories of Kentucky, but he's also out in Iowa. He refers to Chicago frequently, which probably surprises no one. So he's kind of moving around. It's a more broad, sweeping book, but it's still very regional. He's not going to New York. We have enough books about young men going to New York, so he's trying to do something different. He's very concerned with isolation. As we talked about gender nonconformity and gender fluidity, this is a big theme in much of Anderson's output. The questions of sort of what does it mean to be particularly masculine, but also feminine is a big question for him as well. Also, maybe perhaps relating to our earlier technology problems, he's kind of questioning modernity and technology. What does it mean for the country to sort of enter this new industrial, mass-produced age of the factory? What is that doing to people? What is that doing to culture? What is that doing to our ability to understand one another and to understand ourselves? And that's a theme that he returns to again and again. If you read Dark Laughter, his later novel, perhaps Women, which is classified as a collection of essays, but that's perhaps a little bit of a forced classification. A lot of it is very different. There's a mix of poetry and other passages in that. So he's very concerned with those questions. So, like, what does it mean to be on the verge of this new century? And then how do we kind of react to that? And of course, small town rural life. The vast majority of the stories are set in small town rural settings. Portraying those lived experiences is valid and is important. As he said, in a quote, in his memoir, he kind of denies perhaps protesting too much. He says, Weinsberg wasn't really a real place. It was a real place. He says it's more of a mythologized town than a real town. He says it's people, it is people. Which I think that part of it rings true. That it is about people who live elsewhere. I think we have that here with the Triumph of the Egg. Even though he's taking a much broader geographic scope, it is ultimately about these people who represent different aspects of that scope. So I think the important thing to think about in terms of the two books is that he is working through the same themes in both of them over and over again. It's sort of like a writer in progress. He's coming back, he's revisiting themes, he's reworking themes. He's still trying to figure things out. I think that's part of the undercooked nature of a lot of his work. Is that he was always kind of rushing to the next idea or the next way to think about these profound questions that are moving him. He didn't always kind of stop to his benefit to really flesh out what he was doing. But I do think the similarities between Weinsberg and Triumph of the Egg, I think you have to read them together. I do think there's a lot of value in reading these works side by side and not seeing Weinsberg as sort of this outlier in his career. Triumph is just as important. It's just as, I think, aesthetically pleasing as Weinsberg. It's just as important as Weinsberg. They very much speak to each other in vital ways. And I think we do a disservice if we just look at one and not the other. We need to understand what's motivating him as an artist. And I think if you look at the two of them together, you can begin to understand sort of what it's really triggering. Yes.
So that's something that we really wanted to emphasize is the idea that if you read Weinsberg, then it kind of naturally follows to read The Triumph of the Egg as well. They really do speak to one another in really significant ways. And again, they're not interconnected in terms of characters and things like that, but thematically, they're so interconnected. And specifically, David D. Anderson, who was kind of a foundational Sherwood Anderson scholar and the founder of the Society for the Study of Midwestern Literature, argued that we really need to, rather than just picking out individual stories from Weinsberg or from The Triumph of the Egg, read them consecutively, read the whole thing, rather than just bits and pieces, rather than just the stories that get published individually or published in an anthology. Read the whole thing, because there's kind of a narrative arc that you follow from beginning to end that is really unclear if you just sort of skim individual stories. So what The Triumph of the Egg does is it takes what Anderson did on this really microscopic, small scale of looking at one town, right? Looking at Weinsberg, Ohio, and he takes that same really fine lens that he's using and just expands it enormously, right? So we have, rather than just one very intimate, close-up look at a small town, he's taking that and looking at the Midwest more broadly. So he's saying these things that exist in Weinsberg, these people, these places, themes, fears, they exist throughout the Midwest. And he does extend it a little bit more, as Aaron said, he goes to the border states as well. But really what The Triumph of the Egg proves is that every Midwestern town, not just Weinsberg, has a George Willard, right? As Aaron said, The Triumph of the Egg doesn't have a George Willard, but it's kind of extending that same idea of, well, he's kind of everywhere, kind of a small town fixture, right? So Wayne Biddlebaum and Helen White and Kate Swift and the Reverend Curtis Hartman and all of these really memorable names from Winesburg, they appear in different ways in The Triumph of the Egg. They're not the same names, but they're the same kind of archetypes, the same figures that you would recognize from one book to another. And in terms of the themes that sort of carry over from one book to another, the idea of loneliness, right, is something that is really pervasive in Winesburg, Ohio. And in Winesburg, Anderson writes in the story Adventure, many people must live and die alone, even in Winesburg. And in The Triumph of the Egg, he does something really similar, right? He says in the story Brothers, the whole story of mankind's loneliness, of the effort to reach out to unattainable beauty, tried to get itself expressed from the lips of a mumbling old man, crazed with loneliness, who stood by the side of a country road on a foggy morning, holding a little dog in his arms. It's so beautiful. The whole story of mankind's loneliness is rendered in just this one, I know, this man just holding a dog by the side of the road. So these themes, again, he's saying the same thing in these two books, just with different characters, different episodic moments, right? It's carrying over. He's saying it's not just Winesburg, it's kind of the American or human experience. And then finally, in terms of thinking about Winesburg and The Triumph of the Egg, everyone remembers, right, that Winesburg starts with the Book of the Grotesques, right? He's replicating that idea of these grotesques, these people who are memorable for sort of representing an idea. They exist throughout the Midwest and beyond. Everyone's preoccupied with their ambitions, with loneliness, with the desire to be loved, with the desire to do something, to be successful. It's not just Winesburg. And really that's what Triumph of the Egg is doing, is saying it's not just Winesburg, it's throughout the Midwest. He's talking about the human experience.
So, race is not a major issue really in Winesburg. It came up. But by the 1920s, it was unavoidable. Certainly in the West, the Great Migration, you have massive amounts of African Americans coming north for the first time. And I think Anderson's responding to that, as you mentioned, with the sort of lens, right? He starts small with a small town, but now he's trying to understand more broadly sort of what does it mean to be in these different kind of perhaps forgotten corners of American life. And he sees race as one of those corners. But before we talk about the Triumph of the Egg itself, I want to give us two pieces to kind of bookend where Anderson's kind of sitting in the middle. The first is from Paul Laurence Dunbar, another Ohioan, who's Dayton. And this is probably his most famous poem. These are the opening lines from We Wear the Mask. It's a very short poem, it's less than 15 lines. But this is how it begins. He says, "We wear the mask that grins and lies, it hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, the torn and bleeding heart through smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties." The whole poem is about existing in Jim Crow era United States as a black man. Sort of what you have to kind of do, what gestures you have to make to survive. And he never mentions race at all in the poem, but it's all implied in this piece. This is 1896. This is earlier, the height of Jim Crow. In 1925, so 4 years after The Triumph of the Egg appears, Alan Locke writes, he's a big figure for the Harlem Renaissance. He writes The New Negro, and he says, "The day of aunties and uncles and mammies is equally gone. Uncle Tom and Sambo have passed on. The popular melodrama has played itself out, and it is time to scrap the fiction's garret and bogies and settle down to a realistic facing the facts." So between these two periods, we have a kind of different view of black identity appearing, right? On the one hand, Paul Laurence Dunbar is sort of talking about the accommodations one makes, the self-effacements one makes to kind of get by, and Alan Locke is saying, well, I'm done with that. We need to be done with that. And Anderson's The Triumph of the Egg kind of sits in the middle of this moment. He's, on the one hand, influenced by the much earlier sort of popular image of black identity, formed by minstrelsy in some ways. is portrayed in that book, with how, Anderson tackles race and crime today. He focuses sort of on childlike innocence. His black characters oftentimes are described as being sort of much closer to nature, much closer to children, and he means this complimentary, in a complimentary sense, but a complimentary stereotype is still a stereotype, right? So he, on the one hand, is kind of fetishizing black identity as this purer thing, this more connected thing. And it's probably, I think, a result of his kind of fears about modernity, right? That mass production has made it difficult for the white man to kind of be that close to the natural world, to be that close to sort of whatever human condition he's identifying within sort of these black characters, this innocence that he sees there. So he's kind of taking this primitivist view, right? That there's sort of this innate quality that white Americans lost because of so that's on the one side. So in two of the stories that feature black characters, I Want to Know Why is the most famous one. He kind of used that line. He draws sort of on the Uncle Remus imagery, those sorts of things. Again, it's not necessarily meant to derogatory, but it reads uncomfortably to my audience, certainly. We can see that he is kind of influenced by what Alan Locke is kind of claiming we need to get rid of. But there is a complication to this. The closing sort of section, forgive me, I'm going to read from it. The closing poem, called The Man with the Trumpet, which I mentioned previously, I think complicates a simple reading of Race and Triumph as sort of drawing on this minstrelsy past. So it goes like this. It says, I stated it as definitively as I could. I was in a room with one. They had tongues like me and hair and eyes. I got up out of my chair and said it as definitively as I could. Their eyes wavered. Something slipped out of their grasp. Had I been white and strong and young enough, I might have plunged through walls, gone outward in nights and days, gone into prairies, into distances, gone outward to the doorstep of the house of God, gone to God's throne room with their hands in mine. What I am trying to say is this. By God, I made their minds to be out of them. Their minds came out of them as clear and straight as anything could be. I said they might build temples to their lives. I threw my words at faces floating in a street. I threw my words like stones, like building stones. I scattered words in alleyways like seeds. I crept at night and threw my words in empty rooms of houses in a street. I said that life was life, that men in streets and cities might build temples to their souls. I whispered words